next Chapter 3 and explores the topic of diversity and the implications it will have on your career as an educator. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify the 4 sources of diversity among your students, draw informed conclusions about the nature of culture, define the practice of culturally responsive teaching, and distinguish various dimensions of diversity, including linguistic, ethnic, racial, learning preferences, and gender-related patterns of diversity. Evidence of the diverse nature of the students you will work with will originate from a variety of sources that it will include but will not be limited to the elements that you see pictured here, starting first with culture. Culture, as defined here, is the knowledge, attitudes, values, and customs that characterize a social group. Next, we have language, which is the traditional way of communicating with others. Then there's gender, which are the defined differences between boys and girls. Finally, there's exceptionalities, which are characteristics in students resulting in them needing extra help to reach their full potential. The country is growing browner and browner by the decade. More than 1/3 of the U.S. population currently are members of a cultural minority. About 40% of the current school populations are also members of cultural minorities. Children of color are more than 90% of the school population of the 5 American cities you see named here. In 2010, and for the first time in American history, less than 50% of the nation's 3-year-olds were white. And the school year that just began in August witnessed the first time in history when more non-white children entered kindergarten than did white children. Now, I have more data here supporting the growth of America's non-white population, and that's data that is rooted in immigration statistics. In the early 1900s, most of America's immigrants came from Europe. This has not been the case in nearly 100 years because more recently immigrants have come from places like Central and South America, Asia, the Caribbean basin, with less than 15% coming from Europe. So what does all of this mean, and what impact does it have on your career as an educator? Well, despite all the data that has just been shared with you, the one thing, and I think the most important thing that we all need to remember is that fundamentally children really are more alike than they are different. Parents of cultural minorities care just as deeply about their children and their success in school as members of the majority population do. It's just that sometimes this shared desire for children to succeed in life may manifest itself in ways that we are not necessarily accustomed to. Our students will therefore enter our classroom with different ways of acting and believing. And these different ways of believing is in no small way defined by the cultural backgrounds that they are from. So, as educators, what we must do is we must do our best to communicate that all cultures are valued and respected. We must also find effective ways of capitalizing on the varied experiences that our students bring to our schools and leverage these experiences in ways that will promote their success. One major way to do that is to engage in a practice known as culturally responsive teaching. Culturally responsive teaching is a practice that acknowledges and embraces cultural diversity as a way to inform how we will go about teaching our students. Strategies may include such tactics as building on students' cultural backgrounds, accommodating different patterns of cultural interaction, and accepting and valuing cultural differences. Now, this next slide here presents a case study where you have a math teacher who attempts to do just that. I want you to take a moment to read the scenario posed here and take a look at the questions that follow it. There are actually going to be 3 questions that in Canvas you all will be required to contribute to a discussion board forum that is related to this case study. Your participation in this forum will count as your attendance for the class that is not meeting on Tuesday, February the 3rd. I will offer an audio taped response to the 3 questions where you will receive my insight and my perspectives, but you'll only be able to access this once the forum closes on Tuesday night. What are those 3 questions that you're responding to? Which, by the way, are also going to be available on that same discussion board forum that I am asking you to participate in. Here they are. I want you to, after having read this case study, identify one simple thing that Jack did in his instruction that is an essential part of culturally responsive teaching based on your understanding of it, as has been just presented to you on the previous slide, and also as has been discussed in Chapter 3 of your text. I want you to identify a second simple strategy that Jack used that can be effective with students who are members of cultural minorities. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, what might be some culturally responsive teaching strategies that you will employ in your own classroom? And of course, I will expect different answers from among you all, since you all have different areas of interest professionally. So take a few moments to reflect on this, go over to the discussion board on Canvas, and make your voices heard. And again, your participation there will count as attendance for Tuesday, February the 3rd. Switching gears here, I now want to turn our attention to linguistic diversity. Consider this statistic. By the year 2030, more than 40% of the school's population will be enrolled in programs that are designed to teach English. Now, in educational circles, students who will be in need of these services are what's known as English language learners, or ELL students. They may also be referred to as ESOL students. ESOL is an acronym which stands for English as a Second Language. Obstacles to school success that will exist for our English language learner students are the following. For starters, they're more likely than non-EL students to be referred for special education services. Special education services that do not include language support services, but are more in the intellectual deficiency category. They're more likely to drop out of school, and they tend to lag behind in achievement. Does this mean that English language learner students are less capable than non-EL students? Of course, it doesn't mean that at all. But with a country that is growing ever more linguistically diverse, it's important as educators for us to come to terms with strategies and tactics that will help these students be more successful, which will in turn improve our educational system overall. The fact that we're growing ever more linguistically diverse is evident to everybody, including big business. Take a look at this Coca-Cola commercial that I'm about to pull up here in a new window, going over to our friends over at YouTube. Some of you might recall this commercial. It aired during last year's Super Bowl. And some of you might also remember the controversy surrounding the airing of this commercial.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, por tus olas de granos ámbar, yo pisinasakote sa ibabaw ng mga prutas. America, America, God shed His grace on thee. For mahijane ke saath aaj tera chadla
So yes, what does it say that you have an iconic American brand in Coca-Cola airing a commercial like this during the Super Bowl, which itself is another American icon seen by millions of people? I mean, what kind of statement is Coca-Cola making here? It's, I think, more than just an acknowledgement that we are a diverse nation, and that's part of the strength and has historically been a part of the strength of this country. But the fact that you have such an iconic American song like America the Beautiful being sung in all those languages, can you guys maybe think of some reasons as to why there be some people in some circles who would have problems with that? And maybe what some of the controversies were as to why people felt offended or did not like this commercial at all? Well, this is the role, or rather, this is the world that you all are about to be a part of professionally. Children who come from all different kinds of backgrounds, where language is going to be a big part of how those backgrounds are going to be defined. Now, what you see here is a chart that lays out the 4 types of bilingual education programs that are in operation to some degree in most public American school systems across the country. The chart reads from top to bottom, going from top to bottom, the kinds of support for English language learner students from top to bottom flow from that which is most supportive of their needs to that which is least supportive of their needs. In other words, if you look at the immersion form of bilingual education programs, the immersion approach pretty much follows a sink or swim approach to the English language. It's a program in where students are placed in classrooms where only English is spoken. There are fewer little linguistic aids. The idea here is that if you immerse students in the English language in such a fashion that they will have no choice but to grasp the language if they want to be successful and have a shot at understanding what is going on. But of course, a huge disadvantage to that approach is that students may feel overwhelmed and they may leave feeling confused and discouraged. This might be particularly true of the older students. Maybe not so much with younger students, because research shows that younger students are very capable and adept at picking up multiple languages. But certainly with some of your older students, the immersion approach may not be the best approach to take in supporting their ultimate success in school. The bilingual maintenance program is one that is the most supportive of English language learner students, as it falls on the spectrum that you're being shown here. One advantage is that students may become literate in 2 languages, but some critics believe that participating in such programs will slow the acquisition of English down and will in some ways handicap the students in the long run. So take a look at this chart. I've actually provided a copy of this chart as well as a hard copy of this entire presentation on Canvas that you're free to download and follow along as you need to if there are perhaps points in the audio lecture that you miss and would like a little bit more of a reinforcement on. I'd like to now turn our attention to the element of gender diversity. Take a look at these 6 statements and tell me or consider which one of these statements are true. Women earn more bachelor's and master's degrees in our nation's colleges than do men. I should have said men there, not boys. Boys are referred for disciplinary actions much more often than are girls. Boys are in more special education classes and are held back in grades more often than are girls. Boys drop out of school more often than do girls. Boys score higher on the SAT and ACT than do girls. And finally, is this statement of many more boys than girls choose engineering and computer science as college majors, is that statement true? Which of these statements, if any, are true? Well, all of them are true. And what might be surprising to some is probably questions 1 and 5. They seem to contradict each other. Boys score higher on SAT and ACT tests than do girls, yet women earn more bachelor's and master's degrees than do men. Wonder what the correlation is there, since these college entrance exams are designed to purportedly predict the level of or the rate of future success in college. Is it something with the test? Is it something to do with how men process things more so than do women? Does it have something to do with the structure of college in general and how it may favor ways in which women or girls prefer to learn? Well, acknowledging the value of creating a gender equitable classroom is your first step in creating such an environment for your students. Now, we won't go into a whole lot of detail about that at this juncture, nor will we really get to cover that in a lot of depth in EDF 1005. That is what EDF 2085, which is the course that follows this one, is designed to do. So there's much more conversation and discussion about this issue of creating a gender equitable classroom that you will be exposed to should you enroll in EDF 2085. But I will say here that there are a number of strategies that you can employ to promote a more gender equitable classroom environment. And some of these tactics include communicating openly with your students about gender issues and concerns. In other words, we don't need to pretend that there aren't differences between boys and girls. The differences are not a matter of, whether these differences are worse or better, or what makes this gender better or more suitable for learning or more suited to learn, if you will. Different means just that. It's just different. So how do you do that? Maybe you'll want to conduct class discussions about boys and girls' views, needs, and perceptions of how they're treated. And of course, you will want to do this in a disciplined and age-appropriate fashion. Try to eliminate gender bias in instructional activities. One way you might go about doing that is to call on boys and girls as equally as possible and give them similar roles in all learning activities. In other words, if you do group assignments, for example, don't automatically make the leaders of all your groups boys, or don't automatically make all the leaders of your groups girls, or have the girls serve as recorders and recorders only. Mix up the roles that they will play in the learning activities so as not to perpetuate any form of bias in the way in which instructional activities are conducted. Present students with non-stereotypical role models. I think this will be a particularly effective strategy for all the elementary school teachers out there to take. Maybe you want to invite female engineers and male nurses into your classes to talk to your students about what they do, and therefore expose them to non-traditional career roles, which in time, hopefully, we'll be able to totally do away with the whole non-traditional label as more and more women move into engineering or law enforcement, and more men move into the so-called caring professions like nursing, like teaching for that matter. So let's talk about, or let's consider rather, another case study example or some questions for reflection. Read the questions that are presented here and are also a part of that downloadable document that accompanies this lecture. In Canvas, you're going to be required to participate in a forum discussion related to these questions, and your responses to these questions will be a part of getting credit for the class that's not meeting on Tuesday, February the 3rd. I really look forward to reading your responses to these questions because I think that they are worthy of thought and worthy of conversation. Look at this first question here. Should teachers have boys and girls line up by sex or compete in games by sex? Why or why not? I know that frequently it was my own experience that My colleagues and I frequently engaged in Boys Against Girls for things like test review Jeopardy. And, well, that I think has some merit, but some may not agree that it does have any merit at all and that there's no merit in segregating the genders in such a way. So where do you come down on that issue? Think about that, consider it, offer up your thoughts in Canvas on the discussion board that I've set up for you to do that. Look at this next question. How about single-sex classrooms? Do you think that's a good idea? What about single-sex schools? What are your feelings on that? And suppose you were hired to teach in a single-sex school or classroom. What would be different about the way in which you taught? Or would you change anything at all? And, if you want to give some or offer up some examples, that would definitely enhance the depth of your responses to these questions. I want to now look at the dimension of exceptionalities and the impact that will have on your teaching. Students who present various physical, emotional, or intellectual exceptionalities are a significant component of our student population. Look at this statistic that I offer here. More than 6 million students are diagnosed as having exceptionalities, which, as was defined on a previous slide, as having learning or emotional needs that result in these students requiring special help to succeed or to reach their full potential. When it comes to intellectual abilities, also known as intelligence, our views on this concept have moderated quite a bit in recent years, thanks to the work of this Harvard educator right here. This gentleman's name is Howard Gardner. And in 1983, Gardner, who, as I noted, is an educator and a researcher affiliated with Harvard University, wrote a book entitled Frames of Mind: The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. In the book, he puts forth the basic premise that intelligence can present itself in multiple ways. He identified 7 ways to be exact. But most measures of intelligence that our students take, which are measures that are then used to determine their eligibility for ESE, or Exceptional Student Education Services, only measure 2 forms of intelligence. And so these tests really fail to give an accurate measure or a complete picture of a child's true capabilities. And he feels that this is, in essence, a punitive approach to viewing students and their ability to learn. He's famously quoted as having once said, "It's not about how smart you are, it's about how you're smart." Now, those 7 domains of intelligence that Gardner identified in his book were as follows, and they're going to be presented over the next 2 slides. So you have the linguistic intelligence domain of intelligence. This is a domain of intelligence where sensitivity to the meaning and order of words and the ability to use language is the most prominent. Examples of vocations where linguistic intelligence is probably placed at a premium would be that of being a poet or being a journalist. Perhaps you can think of others. Then you have logical mathematical intelligence, which is the ability to use long chains of reasoning and work effectively with numbers and symbols. Obviously, a lot of your STEM-related disciplines, STEM, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and math, people who are in those disciplines would obviously possess a great deal of this kind of intelligence. But you also have musical intelligence, sensitivity to pitch, melody, and tone. So composers and singers might possess this domain of intelligence. And there's spatial intelligence, which is the ability to accurately visualize and perceive the world. People who are your sculptors and architects possess this form of intelligence. Next, you have body Kinesthetic intelligence, which is the ability to use the body in coordinated movements and handle objects with dexterity. This would be like your dancers and your athletes. They display a great deal of this form of intelligence in how they go about doing what they do. You have interpersonal intelligence, which is an understanding of social interactions among people. So careers where people with this kind of intelligence would excel would include therapists and salespeople. There's intrapersonal intelligence, which is insight into one's own strengths and weaknesses. A clear understanding of self, which, to be a successfully self-aware person, if you will, would embrace this kind of intelligence. And then finally, there's naturalistic intelligence, which is the ability to recognize similarities and differences in the physical world. And careers valuing this form of intelligence would include biologists and anthropologists. Well, as you might imagine, Gardner's work has been hugely influential in educational circles for the last 3 decades. Perhaps even some of you are familiar with it. But Gardner has lately taken issue with how he feels some of his findings have been misinterpreted. In a 2013 update, he addresses some of these misinterpretations, the primary of these being those who he feels make the term multiple intelligences synonymous with learning styles. What I want you to do is click on this link to the Washington Post online column where Gardner, who is still alive incidentally, himself speaks to this issue. I think it is important for educators to have a clear understanding about the multiple realms of intelligences and learning styles, or as has been used more recently, learning preferences, and keeping those two important concepts kind of separate and apart and on their own terms. The only other point that I wanted to make about the multiple domains of intelligences, however, has to do with how most intelligence tests that are administered in this country, what domains they tend to focus on testing and what domains are heavily evaluated to the exclusion of others. There are 2 domains that current IQ tests tend to emphasize and focus on to the exclusion of the other 5. Have you all figured out which 2 of those 7 domains of intelligences most IQ tests measure? Would either one of those 2 intelligences be shown on this screen? How about this one? Those of you who guessed linguistic or logical mathematical intelligence would be correct. In other words, most intellectual ability measures, such as the IQ test, they only tend to measure linguistic intelligence and logical mathematical intelligence. So when students are placed in ESE classes based on scores that they earn on IQ tests, it's because those tests have only measured these 2 domains of intelligences. It doesn't necessarily mean that the child is an imbecile or incapable of garnering knowledge, and it doesn't even mean that he's incapable of acquiring knowledge that would improve his linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence. It just means that he may or she may need help in improving those domains through different means or through different ways. Again, be sure you click on this link to the Washington Post article where Howard Gardner is addressing the apparent confusion he feels that has come about as of late regarding his theory of multiple intelligences and the concept of different learning preferences or learning styles. Assuming that you've read the article and you now have a clearer understanding on the differences between learning styles and multiple intelligences, We can see the value of understanding the styles and preferences of our students in an effort to encourage greater success in our classrooms. Frankly, we should be varying our instruction since no instructional strategy works for all students exactly the same at all times. It's important that we help our students understand how they learn most effectively so that we can tailor activities or tailor modes of instruction to meet those different styles and preferences. The bottom line here is that our students differ in ability, motivation, background experiences, needs, and insecurities. And so the concept of learning styles and preferences can sensitize us to these differences. Since Gardner's theories have become popular in educational circles, or perhaps inspired by other theories, educators have begun to explore other dimensions of intelligence that go beyond even what Gardner identified, such as this particular dimension of intelligence, emotional intelligence. Now, you all as educators will probably come to appreciate this more and more the more you interact with students. The ability for students to manage their emotions so that they can cope with the world around them and to accomplish set goals. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin to tell you how just vitally important that one is. What are some indicators of high emotional intelligence? Students who have the ability to control their impulses, to behave in socially acceptable ways, such as, controlling the impulse to tell another person off after a rude remark or a perceived slight. Students who practice a form of emotional intelligence where they're able to practice self-control is going to be such an appreciated virtue among your students, and one that you will definitely want to help your students cultivate who may lack this dimension when you first start working with them in your classrooms. You have to help students develop emotional intelligence because it helps them to manage negative emotions. For example, the student may not go off, so to speak, on the person who made the rude remark, but they may still have difficulty managing negative emotions surrounding that remark. They may feel bad, for example, and their feeling bad about these negative remarks will cause them to act out in other undesirable ways. So you definitely want to all help our students, regardless of where they may fall on this emotional intelligence spectrum, to ultimately behave in socially acceptable ways, such as how to talk calmly to the person who made said rude remark, or simply learning to leave the situation alone. I feel like this emotional intelligence piece is one that is beneficial for educators across the spectrum, whether you're teaching middle school or high school or elementary school, or yes, sad to say, even college. There's some college students who I can tell you from personal experience, I have needed to kind of help to develop this domain of their personality, just to help them to become a more successful person in life. Well, we have now reached the last topic that this lesson is going to cover. And that topic deals with how federal policies have informed our approach to educating students with exceptionalities. In the year 1975, Congress passed Public Law 94-142, which is known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. People in education love acronyms, if you haven't figured that out by now. But IDEA is a piece of federal legislation that was designed to ensure that learners with exceptionalities receive the best quality education possible. The act was a response to findings that indicated that separating students from their peers resulted in lower levels of learning and development. As a result of this act and the amendments that would follow it, you, as a general education classroom teacher, are certain to have students with exceptionalities in your classroom. And although you will have many more courses of instruction in specific strategies that will be used to work with these students, now is the time to begin preparing mentally for the idea that you will indeed be working with students whose intellectual abilities may require additional assistance to help students to reach their full potential. Now, I have here some of the key provisions of IDEA that what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put up and allow you to kind of process along with the downloadable document that goes with this presentation. I don't want to necessarily insult your intelligence by reading out this entire screen word for word, because you're more than capable of doing that yourself. I will tell you, though, that, or I just want to point out a few things here as we go along. A free and appropriate public education, a least restrictive environment, and the individualized education program are probably the elements of IDEA that most general ed classroom teachers are going to have the most interaction with. Now, of course, if you are looking to be an exceptional student educator, you're going to be dealing with the provisions of IDEA in a far more in-depth way. But even general education classroom teachers have to be familiar with the individual education program, which is also known as the IEP. The IEP is an individually prescribed instructional plan that is used with students who have documented exceptionalities. 75% of those students who have been identified with possessing an exceptionality of any kind are going to more than likely come from these four common categories: the learning disabled, those with communication disorders, intellectually disabled, and those with behavioral disorders. Again, this is all spelled out for you on the accompanying document that you'll be able to download in Canvas. So do make sure you review that document thoroughly. Here's a couple of scenarios that will probably help you to identify the learning problems that those documents that I'm referring to, or that document rather that I'm referring to, and the previous two slides help hopefully define for you. Let's look at the case of Jackie. Jackie struggles with her classroom or her classwork and seems rather immature for her age. She seems to know very little about the outside world and has a difficult time understanding concepts that aren't concrete. She's also a poor reader. So which one of those categories of exceptionalities would you say best fits Jackie's particular exceptionality based on the information that's been presented to you? Let's take a look at the next one. Sonia is withdrawn and rarely speaks in class. She is very timid and doesn't seem to have any friends. So which exceptionality does it appear that Sonia, that best categorizes the exceptionality that Sonia has? Take a look at this next one. Raul has a very difficult time with reading. He reverses words and often loses his place when he reads. Fortunately, he is a very good math student, however. So which one of those categories of exceptionalities would you say Raul fits into? Ready for those answers? The answers from the previous scenarios are going to be presented here. Starting first with Jackie. In her case, her lack of knowledge about the world, her immaturity, her poor reading ability, and the inability on her part to understand abstract concepts may suggest an intellectual disability. But of course, it's impossible to specify for certain without appropriate evaluation. Then there's Sonia. Sonia's social isolation, timid behavior, and isolation are indicators of an internalizing behavior disorder. And that could have an impact on her ability to perform academically. Then there's Raul and his problems with reading, and the fact that he's a very good math student might suggest that he has a specific learning disability in reading. Now, we as educators, we're not asking you guys to hold a dual license or degree in psychology, although frankly that might be helpful. But fortunately for those of you who may not want to acquire all that training, you don't have to. You truly don't. You're going to have a cast of caring professionals and guidance counselors, school psychologists, and behavioral specialists who have all been trained to support the work that you will do in the classroom. It is, however, helpful for teachers to have a working knowledge of these different conditions to identify the professionals and resources that they and their students can connect with to help them to reach their full potential, which again, this is what it's all about, right? Well, let's look at those who are on the higher end of the exceptionality spectrum. These are the students who will be identified as gifted or talented. These students will exhibit certain traits that will include the ability to learn more quickly and independently than their peers. Oftentimes, gifted or talented children have advanced language, reading, and vocabulary skills and may be more highly developed in learning and metacognitive strategies. They might also exhibit a higher motivation on challenging tasks and less on easy ones. In other words, it's easy for them to get bored. They may also have high personal standards of achievement. And a lot of your gifted and talented children, they may have a perfectionist streak that might inhibit their ability to attain higher levels of learning because these will be your students who, if it doesn't come easily to them the first go around or the first time that they're exposed to it, they will have a tendency to want to give up. Many advocates for gifted education feel as if those who are at the higher end of the exceptionality spectrum do not often get as much attention as those who are on the lower end of the spectrum. And those that are in smaller or less resourced districts are students that typically they feel are the ones who get shortchanged unfairly. Now, there are federal laws that are put in place to ensure quality education and access to services, needed services, to those who are gifted and talented. There was a law that was passed in 1988 called the Javits Act. That's referenced in Chapter 3 of your book. And this is a federal policy that regulates or is designed to give policy to how gifted and talented students are to receive educational services in the public school system. But I want you to consider this question as you think about working with students with exceptionalities. How should you modify your instruction when you work with students who have exceptionalities, whatever those exceptionalities might be? Check this out. You should know that there's little evidence that indicates that learners with exceptionality should be taught in ways that are fundamentally different from all students. In other words, effective instruction for all students are also effective instructional techniques that would work with students with exceptionalities. It also suggests that strategies that work for students in general should also work with students who have exceptionalities, and those strategies might have to simply be implemented more carefully and more thoroughly. Perhaps it is heartening to note that the same ethics of caring, sensitivity to the needs of the students, and the belief that all children can learn that benefit the general population of students also apply to those with exceptionalities. Good and Brophy said it best when they said that, quote, "In general, the classroom management and instructional approaches that are effective with special students tend to be the same ones that are effective with other students. Good teachers know this. Good teachers practice this. And that is the number one takeaway that I want you to leave this part of the lesson with. This concludes this lesson. Don't forget to participate in those discussion board forums that were referenced at earlier points in this lesson that have been set up in Canvas in order to receive credit for class attendance for Tuesday, February the 3rd.